So we are going to be talking about the topic of Black men healing, and we're gonna just explore, different facets of it. You guys can tell your stories of how you're healing, your healing journey, and just post questions. So I'll just get started on like what I have experienced with supporting Black men in their healing journey.
Okay.
Some of the different things that they come into the platform experiencing. So I am a licensed therapist, holistic healer, and I have a platform for Black men that's specifically geared towards Black men's restoration and healing process. We create safe, sacred spaces for Black men to be transparent and to get necessary healing information to help them get more in alignment with their higher self, with their higher calling outside of institutionalized programming. So some of the things that in my career with helping Black men I've experienced is just the lack of self-awareness when it comes to identifying who they are outside of the system. They struggle a lot with identity around like who they are initially, like born into, like what are their birthrights, what are some of the limited beliefs they may have around the authority that they really carry just naturally as Black men, and they really have a difficult time with being honest about how much power they really have inside of themselves. I think that one of the things that I've noticed is the system that they have to be successful in, right?
Mm-hmm.
It really tailors and waters down and really diminishes the Black man down to a specific narrative for them to be successful in three categories. And what I've seen in the three categories is you're either super high achieving, and as you're gaining that sociological status, you have to die more of who you are innately to in order to assimilate into that narrative. Another one, a narrative I've seen is like then you'll have like the father, like the one you may be coming from like trauma around like fatherhood, trauma around like manhood, and like you be the one that's vindicating like, okay, this is like in this space in my life I'm going to do XYZ, right? And then I've seen it in relationships where they struggle with like their identity as far as like relationship leadership, like who are they and where do they fit in when it comes to maybe their narrative is outside of what a successful family or relationship looks like, right? Like how do they navigate that and still show up being a strong Black man and being able to lead their family in a way that doesn't make them seem like a deadbeat or like a disadvantaged person or like a problem to society. So those are just some of the three key areas that I feel like I work with Black men in and we kind of navigate. And so I just wanted to get like more feedback on what your experiences have been and the healing space of Black men and just some of the narratives that you guys have faced and had to combat.
Yeah. I think I can definitely. There's a lot there, Nia. I appreciate you laying those out. I could talk about healing in all three. I think for me, one of the things that I've been most proud of more recently in my life in terms of my healing journey is my relationship with my own father. Mm-hmm. So like when I was born. My mom's white. My dad's Black. My mom was my primary caregiver for the first. They were together till I was like 3. Then they broke up, and a lot of the memories I have of them actually breaking up and then having joint custody of me. But it was one of those situations where I was with my mom primarily all the time, and my dad like every like one Wednesday a month or like every other weekend, something very very small. And so I went from living with my mom primarily to my dad like in a night, like a month after my 7th birthday. And I could tell as a child that my dad, I knew my dad loved having a kid, but I could tell that my dad wasn't necessarily enthralled maybe of being a single parent. Like I don't think that was ever in his cards. And so he kind of raised me with like a very firm, very strict, way. I often joke with him, and he hates this, but I often say he kind of like Denzel in Fences, if y'all have seen Fences. And from growing up, it was just always like walking on eggshells around him. Like any one thing, Andre, take out the trash. Andre, go do the dishes. Like clean your room. Like any little thing, it could be like, man, I was about to do it. And it wasn't until recently when I came back home, moved back from Atlanta and teaching and all that stuff, that me and him actually were able to sit down. It was like actually at the beginning of COVID, the pandemic, where I kind of told him my experience growing up as a child under his roof and under his care, while expressing like all the gratitude. Definitely gave me all these different great mindsets that I use now. But it was always, I was looking for more than just a a father figure in terms of this is the right and wrong. I was looking for somebody who was also like a friend, somebody who we could have intimate dialogues about what was really bothering me and how things were impacting me. And it was interesting to hear him and his perspective about the things I was going through, and how he experienced it. And ultimately, like, I mean, now we don't argue at all. We don't talk. And that went from like every time we would talk, it would always be something he had to get on me about. And I would be like, hey, I'm 28 now. You're not going to talk to me like I'm 18 or 17. But to now, we communicate really effectively. But it's one of those interesting journeys because I think it's potentially a lot of men out there potentially have that if they don't have a direct father in their life, but they have a father figure who kind of fills that role. And I think it was also a way that me and my father could explore what it looked like to be black men and be vulnerable in a world that expects us to have our armor on and go to war every day. But we could let our guard down and really, show love and compassion for each other and in our minds. So that's kind of like one of the journeys I've been on recently, and very, very grateful for it. Yeah.
What do you feel like the shift was as far as like, so when you talk about black men being vulnerable, that's like, vulnerability. What do you mean by that, right? So like someone had to be the change agent in that relationship for it to happen, and often more times than not, it's more likely the child who does that shape shifting. Do you feel like you were the person who created that space for the two of you? And if so, like, how did you do that?
Yeah. I actually was doing, I was doing a journal called a shadow journal, which is like, it gives you like a prompt and you meditate on it and you see what comes up. And the prompt was something like, think about a time in your life where you felt weak. And I couldn't shake, like, all the times where I felt weak in my meditation were like all times that involved me and my father. Like when I was a kid, whether I was playing basketball and I felt like he could have advocated for me better with my coaches, which he just would never do. Or it was, times where he was getting upset at me or yelling at me for something, grades, not cleaning up, just something. And once I had that in my head and I kind of like left that space and I stopped that meditation, I immediately started crying. And then I was like, one, my grandmother was always there for me in those moments, which I immediately called her. But two, it was like, I got to have this conversation with my dad. Like, I have to approach him on this. So I hit him up, or he came to the house and we talked it up. And I was like, hey, man, I want to have a serious conversation with you, but I want to do it on your terms, right? Like, I want to let you know that there's going to be a lot of emotion for me from this, which potentially could arise emotion in you. But I think it's necessary, and I think it'll be really good for us if we have it. But I don't want to do it at a time where you don't want to do it, because my dad's very like, when he wants to do things, it's his way. So he came over like later in the week. He was like, oh yeah, I can come over on Thursday. He came over later in the week and we just sat down. I got him like something to drink and we just sat there for 4 hours. But it was really me creating that space, I think, by creating the invitation that allowed him to feel like, he could enter that space and have that dialogue with me.
Was it hard for him to not show up defensive at first? And like, if it was, like, how did you manage your emotions? Because I know that when we talk about childhood memories, we like tap back into that childhood like center and space. So I'm just more so inquisitive about like, how did you respond naturally, right? And then, like, how did you hold your regards, like, then, because that's a 4-hour conversation. Right. So that's a lot of delegation and listening and navigating, right? So, like, how did you expand that conversation? I probably could have been stopped in 3 seconds to then expanding it to 4.
Right. It's funny that I started laughing because there was this specific moment in the conversation where I kept saying things and he would be like, no, nah. And I was like, hey, wait, Dad, let's pause real quick. You keep saying no or nah. Like, are you saying no, that didn't happen? Because I'm just talking about my perspective, right? I'm saying, like, from my perspective as a child, this is how I felt. And he would be like, no, he's like, oh no, that's me trying to, in my head, think about how I thought about it and whether I agree with how you thought about it. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. If you could just change maybe a word or two, not say no, because that to me makes it feel invalidating. And it was really just, I mean, from that space, we really, he did come up. I mean, I would interpret some of the things he did as defensive. He might argue with me on that. But I think ultimately, through my ability to navigate those types of conversations, by having been a principal and a teacher and having to do that with kids all the time, I was able to, like, and other adults really, I was able to help kind of like guide the conversation in the way that I knew would be the most effective for us. But I was also willing to at any point say, hey, let's put a pause in this and we'll come back if it ever got there. But it didn't. And he was really receptive even when I said like, hey, this is how I'm feeling about the way that you're responding to me in this moment. He was able to then, like share where his mind was going and not say that it was about that. So
yeah, so it's totally reparenting. So a lot of shadow work around it. I'm interested, and Justin, maybe you could piggyback off this. Like, have you been in a situation because okay, so what it's called is parentification, and basically it's when you as a child have to be either emotionally more mature than your parent, or you have to be structurally more mature than your parent. Like for example, I was parentified. And the fact that after a while, I had to get myself to school, make sure my grades were good, make sure that I was dressed and like ready to go. And I was cooking like full course meals at 7, right? And that was a tradition, in our family that was passed down, but it was passed down from single motherhood and not having enough people to really nurture and care for a child, so it just became a way that you raise a child, right? So how I see this predominantly with Black men is that they're having to be more mature at an earlier state, and it's either a fear-based response to like some type of like scarcity. So scarcity would be like a lacking of something, like a lacking of a caregiver being there, or a lacking of like emotional stability, or environmentally, like you're seen as a man very early on in age, and so like you don't really get to live out your childhood experiences to the fullness because you're now in a head of household, or everyone's looking at you to be the person that has it together because maybe you're sound in mind. So Justin, you had said like off camera that like you're really aware of your emotions and you're in tune with them. In the realm of like what we're talking about right now, what Andre just shared, like have you had experiences like that, like when it comes to your healing process, where you've had to like maybe be the leader in places where you wanted to be more vulnerable in?
For sure, and it's funny you say that because when it comes to like me and my family, I am the backbone, and my parents, I never got to see my mom and dad together, and then my mom was with my little sister's father after, and then my stepdad now. But no matter what man came or went, I always was like the man of the house. Like even when I went away to school, like and my sisters and my mom would get into it, I'm the only boy, so they would like call and tell on each other to me.
Wow.
You know what I mean? Still to this day, and. But for me personally, healing, I think it's interesting you say that because for me, I had to take some pressure off of myself, and I had to kind of, I started to see a lot. So I was the first person to go to college in my family, and me playing sports, going to college, I had this pressure from my dad, and he never really understood it. My family never really understood it. I didn't even understand it until I got out of college and started to like heal on my own. And what it came down to was like I held myself to such a high standard that whenever I didn't achieve a goal of mine, it kind of put me in a real deep depression. You know what I mean? And I felt like my family put even more pressure on me. Not intentional, of course, but subconsciously they did add to that pressure. And I think that's part of the reason why I always like to live away. And I always like to isolate myself just because that was my time to like process and deal with it. But yeah, with my father, my dad was a guy who was in the streets his whole life, so he wasn't really, he has his same like, oh, I'm the daddy, what I say goes, and my dad had a like, my dad's a pretty big name out here when it came to the streets, you know what I mean, to the point to where my last name kind of either could get me in some trouble or keep me out of some trouble, you know what I mean. But it came down to me going to college, and I kind of realized it's like, Dad, you're telling me what I need to do and what I should be doing in something you've never even experienced. How can you tell me how it is to be living away from my family, learning how to grow up as a man? Because I was pretty spoiled, I'm not going to lie. Like, I don't know how to cook to this day. You know what I mean? I didn't even know how to write a letter or mail off a letter, you know what I mean, an envelope in college. I learned all of that shit on the fly. I'd always lived with my mom. My older sister, she cooked and nurtured me, you know what I mean? She braided my hair, everything. Everything I always needed because I was the sports guy. So my family leaned on me to the point to where it broke me. You know what I mean? And then when I didn't get to the NBA, like Dre mentioned earlier, or I just felt like I fell out of love with basketball. I didn't even know how to explain that to my family. I didn't know how to tell my dad as a freshman in college, I don't want to hoop no more.
Right.
You know what I mean? And it's one thing that I had put my whole life and devoted my whole life to kind of never loved me back.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? So when I'm trying to explain that to my parents, and for me, it took me to realize that like they weren't taught anything, and we're blessed enough to have access to more resources and information that they didn't know. And it's to the point now where I am the voice of reason for my mom and my dad still to this day. But now I'm coming at it in a different perspective. You know what I mean? So now I'm able to be more stable and in control of my emotions when I'm dealing with them, when they do something that makes me upset or something I don't agree with, or, you know, like me and my dad I'll cut this part out, but me and my dad had the vaccine talk. And he's telling me like, oh, you need to do this and do that. And I'm just like, bro, you do what you feel is best for you, and I'll do what's best for me and my family.
Right.
And you have to respect that. Like you said, I'm a grown man now.
Right.
You know what I mean? But yeah, that's pretty much similar to what you said, and I kind of went through the same thing.
It's kind of like what the correlations that I'm seeing, like between the two stories, is more so of like having to manage yourselves in situations where probably parents should have showed up, you know, and those more like authoritative places for like not in an authority way, like you said, like your father like do this, do that, and then your family was like, okay, let us nurture him and take care of him because he plays sports. It's more like a see me, hear me, you know, have these conversations and get to know me so that we can have like these conversations about who I am, like as a before I'm anything, I'm Dre, I'm Justin, you know,
but you know,
who am I
not to cut you off, you know what was interesting to me with that is I feel like in me learning myself, I helped my parents learn themselves.
Yeah.
Because if you think about it, like I don't know how old your parents are, but I think my parents are probably like 2 generations removed from slavery. So their upbringing and raising is a certain way, and it's the traditional way. And you have me, somebody who's trying to go against that completely.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it's always going to be a constant battle with them. But now it's to the point where I had to go out and make them a believer. Even with my own healing journey, it's like, okay, you're going to therapy? Yeah. You know what I mean? I have a therapist. I need a therapist. I know I need a therapist. I need to take time away from work. I need to figure myself out because soon I feel like I'm losing myself and I'm going to go crazy. I feel myself on the brink of not being able to bounce back from this. And I don't want that. You know what I mean? And go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I'm interested, like, what are some of, and this question is for the both of you too, is what are some of the things that you were like, okay, I either need to start my healing journey, right? Because it takes a lot of self-awareness to like kind of like have that reality check too. And then like, what was your first steps in doing that?
For me, it was my son.
Okay.
I started to see him mimicking a lot of my, I started to see myself in him. I was a kid who I was known as like a crybaby as a kid. You know what I mean? And I remembered the way that made me feel when people would tease me for that.
Right.
Oh, every time you lose a basketball game, you cry. Or every time something doesn't go your way, you cry. And my son is the same way. Super, super emotional. And I was
passionate.
Right. Yeah. So I would see people, but it's not even, it doesn't have to do with sports. Like it could be something like, the smallest thing he thinks he's gonna get in trouble for, and before you even know what happened, he's crying. You know what I mean? So, for me, it was just seeing him and remembering how I felt as a little boy, and then going back in my trauma and trying to kind of realizing like, damn, this started way sooner than I thought.
Right.
You know what I mean? And it's the fear of letting my son grow up and what I could have turned into. I don't want my son to even have a chance to even sniffing that. So in order for me to be the best father and be able to instill those certain morals and integrity and teaching my son how to critically think through everything, I had to be able to do that.
Right.
You know what I mean? And just take it, like when he hurts himself now, it's like, okay, calm down, take a second. And before you know it, you're not even in pain no more. You know what I mean? It's just the action of that you hitting that hurdle is what shakes you up. And before you know it, you're shaken up for, you know, forever. You don't need to be. You know, you can literally bounce back and work and think your way through it. And I think that kind of opened my eyes for me. And it motivates me to this day. You know, when I have bad days now, it's like I think about my kids, and I didn't have a daughter at the time, but I do now. But it's just like, okay, how do I lead by example? You know what I mean? How do I have to learn these tools in order to, you know, instill them in my kids. So that's kind of my approach to it.
Yeah, you, Dre?
Yeah, I think a lot of it came. If I reflect and think way back, it probably came at the beginning of my teaching career when I just was exposed to a higher volume of different types of trauma across many black students. I taught in like a 99% black population on the south side of Atlanta, and just saw and was experienced just a bunch. But it wasn't until I became a principal that I realized I needed something. I needed different tools. Like, it wasn't the same tools that helped me become a principal so fast at a young age weren't those same tools that served me now as I was leading a community of, upwards of 1,000 people. If we think about all the students, parents, staff, all that stuff, I needed actually, like, on the bear level, it was like, I need somewhere I can be unfiltered, because I can't be that with my staff or my team. I can't be that with my boss. I can't even be that at home, because I won't even talk to my partners about the stuff that I'm dealing with. I need to go somewhere where I can just talk and no one's going to judge me for the things that come out of my mouth. And I realized in doing that that's how I felt a lot of my life. When you were talking, and it really made me think about this time when speaking like with in terms of, like, guiding parents or having them understand certain things about you. When me and my dad were talking, he was like, but you were kind of emotional as a teenager, and you always cared about what other people thought. And I was like, well, you got to think about something, Dad. Like, I went to a high school where they cut me from the basketball team without a really good reason, and then I transferred, and here I am senior year playing in one of the biggest games of my life against that school that I transferred from, and I played the first 5 minutes, had like 6 points, and then the coach takes me out, and I don't get to play the rest of it. It's my senior night. I don't get to play the rest of the game, and we win. And everyone's excited. I'm pissed. I'm crying. I'm banging lockers. Everyone's like, "Why are you mad, Dre?" And I'm like, "Because this was my opportunity." And when I told my dad about that, and I said, "All I wanted you to do was just go to the coach and say, 'Hey, what's up, man?'" And he was like, it really caused him to really think about, kind of the weight that we carry. And I think about all those different stories, my mom dying, all the trauma. I mean, I became a principal because one of my other students died, and I realized I hadn't really actually even dealt with any of that. I just was trying to show up for everyone else. And in order for me to go out here and be a leader, I have to show up for me first. Yeah. I can't be giving nobody from my cup if my cup's empty. Right. If I'm not even filling it up, I can only give from the overflow. So it was, just feeling burnt out at work, just feeling tired, and realizing like I needed something else. I needed a place where I could release, because everything that I was trying to do wasn't working.
Yeah. So both of you mentioned like just being like emotional, and I just wanted to add some like value to that, just because we don't talk about this in the Black community enough. Black people are extremely empathic. Like, we have a huge level of empathy that is in our bodies, it's in our DNA, it's in our minds, it like spews from our souls, and that is how we are able and we're able to be manipulated, because we are high morale people. We really live off of reciprocity. We believe in balancism. We believe in just working in collaboration. And so those are some of the techniques and tools that it stays with you. If it's in your blood, it's in your blood. And I think that because we live in a society that doesn't really support Black men in leading in empathy, like we train our children to not be empathetic, because it's more of a survival mode, a safety precautionary thing than it is anything. Because think about it, like if we are coming from generations of being strong or having like to be pinned against each other when it comes to like who survival of the fittest, who's the strongest one, who can do the most work, like those characteristic traits, and still to this day got rewarded. Right? Emotions don't get rewarded, because emotions provoke thoughts provokes change, and change provokes a disruption in the system. So we raise our children not to be emotional. But I think the most empowering thing that we can do, especially when we have this information, is empower our kids to be emotional. And it's because even like with my daughter, I've always empowered her to speak up for herself, right? Because I understand how people can take authority and use it against children, because their own traumas. And I never wanted to put that much authority into somebody's hand who didn't even love my child. Right? So I think that, and with that, the only caveat I would tell people is that if you create a strong child, the child will be strong in the home too.
Yeah, everywhere. You gotta be prepared for that.
Yeah, right? That's a good point.
And so you gotta
That's a very good point. My son asked me so many questions, but I love it. Though.
Right. You have to be patient with
Right.
yourself first and really watch yourself and how you respond, because I created a very strong, dynamic woman, but I never wanted her to be strong, dynamic in my house.
Yeah.
I wanted her to be subservient, submissive, and listen to authority.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the only caveat that I will share with that. But I definitely want us to stop calling ourselves emotional, because that is part of our superpower,
Yeah.
is to be self-expressed people. And I think that is what gives us the leading edge in leadership, because we are able to get down to a person's level and from an empathic standpoint meet that person eye to eye, face to face, cheek to cheek, shoulder to shoulder, and really be in community and unity with them, which I feel like a lot of if we're being transparent, white leaders are unable to do that because they don't have that level of empathy, because that's just something that's not, it hasn't been fostered generationally. It's not something that has been really provided or given to them. And that's exactly why it's so important for Black men to start being more on their healing journey, so they can take the proper precautions to not hide their emotions and or filter them in someplace else, but to really sit with them and ask themselves those deep questions like you
Right.
guys have always had to ask yourself and be self-aware of it. And the question is what's going on?
And I think to go off what you're saying, one of the things that I came across when I was a principal and was so glad for it. I did a lot of equity work with my staff. Obviously, I work with a diverse staff, and we're serving mostly Black and brown kids, and so I have to figure out a way to get everyone to understand. What I say to my Black staff members ain't always going to be the same.
Right.
It's not always be received the same as my white staff members, and I have to get them to the same place about serving kids. But one of the things that we use, to your point about Black people, empathy, people-centered, was there's this Black dude named Dr. Edwin Nichols, and he developed this study on what he called the philosophical aspects of cultural difference. And one of the most important things that I thought that I got from it was, what he says is, white American Europeans, their orientation is member to object. So they think about their positionality in relation to whatever object is that they control. Versus Black folks, Latinx, and Middle Eastern, theirs is member to member.
Right.
My relationship is only as good as my relationship with someone else. For Asian and Asian Americans, it's member to group. And for Native folks, it's member to spirit. Right. And so when I think about that, a lot. Is like, Black folks, we are so personal, right? That's why when people talk about this idea of Black joy, like you can really understand what that means, right? Like you go to the lake and go to to Juneteenth or whatever it is, and it's nothing but love out there. And Black folks are just, every time you go to a Black event, you go to a barbershop, you go to a beauty salon, everywhere there's home, there's a deep connection between people. And I think about that a lot as a leader, especially in a white dominant society where the natural default setting, because none of them are wrong in and of themselves, but when you promote one over the others,
Right.
then that's where the dissonance lies. And we live in a world that values member to object, but all of
Right.
us naturally, instinctually, we just people to people, right? I'm
Right.
not trying to get over on my people. I just
Right.
want to have those relationships. I'm sure if you could ask Black people, hey, if we could live in a world where there's no money and we just get to vibe with each other all day and have nothing but fun, we would love that world.
Yeah. All right. So I want to say thank you for, your transparency and your stories. I have just one ending question that I want us to leave the audience with, because I understand Black men healing is so important. What do you feel like has been the most beneficial change in your life since you have started your healing journey? And what advice could you give a Black man who's listening to this, who's kind of on a cusp of deciding maybe I should go seek support and resources, or maybe they're just nah, I'm kind of on the fence. What do you feel like? What advice would you give him? So first question is, what's been the most rewarding part of your healing journey? And then the second question is, what advice would you give a Black man who's kind of deciding whether he should start his healing journey or not?
For me, the best part would probably be just, I'll start with the advice. So the advice I would say is, it's okay not to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of one of my main things I remind myself all the time. Nobody has it figured out. as far as when it comes to this thing we call life. Everybody's just doing what they feel is the best thing at that moment, for them or for the people around them. So I always just tell people, don't be afraid to, reach out for another perspective, I'll call it. You know what I mean? And it's good to have somebody who's non-biased, who can, who you can be completely open with, and you don't have to have the fear of judgment and stuff like that. And what was the other part of the question?
And then, like, what's been the most rewarding part of your healing journey thus far?
The most rewarding part is getting to know myself better. I feel like
cold.
for your coat.
My feet are cold, but I don't want to wear my shoes.
Okay. I feel like for so much of my life, I always would seek validation from other people, from outsiders, and now I'm to the point to where the validation comes from me on a consistent basis, and that's like my happy place.
That's awesome. Transformation. What about you, Dre?
Absolutely. I'd say like similar, just piggybacking off that, like my relationship with myself is vastly different now than it was before, right? Like now I'm no longer comparing how I feel internally to how I see other people externally, because those two things that's like apples and oranges. And so just having that opportunity to kind of continue to build that love of self, that self-love, and it's manifesting in great relationships. And I think that's another thing that I love about what the journey has brought me, is just the quality of the relationships that I have in my life are tremendous. And the advice that I would give is like, it's kind of what I said earlier, just, having someone, I think growing up, like I always felt like I had to hide my true thoughts and feelings about the world from the world, because I thought that I wouldn't be accepted. I'm very passionate. I'll speak up on things that like I think other people are going to vibe with me with, but when it came down to frustrations or anger or some of the more negative emotions or even the sad emotions, I would often keep those to myself. And just having somebody who would just listen and offer their perspective, I realized, one, that's valuable for me to just actually release the emotions and the energy that I need to release in a way that's productive and not always trying to hide it. But also, having the space to continue on a journey by having someone else's perspective enlighten my own only furthers that concept you were talking about earlier of empathy, right? It allows me to continue to further the development of that muscle, not only for others, but for myself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think those are great segues. And I think that what I've experienced just through the Restoring the King platform and supporting Black men in my private practice is they just don't be stressing off a lot of stuff no more. Right. They feel more grounded in their leadership ability, not only to like lead themselves first, but like when people are trying to come at them with projections, with the way that they feel like a Black man's narrative should be, they're able to like stand in solidarity with themselves and be like, no. Right. That's just an opinion. Right. Or if they're in situations where they're the only one in the meeting room, and everyone's looking for them to be on the team with the team, and if something bothers them that normally they would have been like, right. That they're like, no, actually that doesn't work for me, and this is the reason why it doesn't work for me. When I hear victory stories like that, and just when the Black men are telling me stuff, they be like, I couldn't wait to tell you this. It's like
that was like every Saturday for us.
That's dope.
I can't wait to tell you this. Like, this happened to me and I did that. And I'm just like, yes, that's what I'm talking about. And then they get the momentum to be like, I'm about to do this next, because like they get that validation that like you've been right. There is nothing wrong with you. You are on the right path and you can use your voice. And I think that when Black men allow that to happen to them over the fear behind healing and being seen, is far much greater than the hardships of the journey. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to segue out of that conversation, and then get into the conversation around like healing journey and relationships. Like,